US President Donald Trump has announced a massive 50% tariff on India, a penalty tariff for India's ties with Russia. As per the executive order signed by Trump, the additional 25% tariff is due to the government of India importing Russian oil. But India stood firm amid this tariff tyranny, as it's being called, that India will protect its own national interests, much like other nations do. Importantly, India has also highlighted the glaring hypocrisy of Trump, that America too trades with Russia, as does the European Union, and yet India is being penalized. Trump was asked about this, and here's what he had said.
India says that the US imports Russian uranium, chemicals, fertilizers, while criticizing their energy imports. Your response to that, sir?
I don't know anything about it. I'd have to check, but we'll get back to you on that. Yeah, please.
Now, Mr. Trump says he has no idea. So let's educate the White House. He may not know, but here's the reality of the US-Russia trade ties. Data from the Office of the United States Trade Representative shows that total trade between the US and Russia stood at around $5.2 billion in 2024. More recent numbers from the US Census Bureau and the Bureau of Economic Analysis shows that US imports from Russia dropped to $2.5 billion in the first half of 2025 from $14.14 billion 4 years earlier. Still, since January 2022, the US has imported a total of $24.51 billion worth of goods from Russia. Let's break that down further for you, particularly the major imports. In fertilizers, the US imported $1.27 billion worth in 2024, so that's actually gone up from $1.14 billion in 2021. The war clearly doesn't matter here. Uranium and plutonium. Imports there stood at $624 million in 2024, slightly down from 2021. Palladium imports were worth $878 million in 2024, down from $1.59 billion in 2029. So there at least there's been a dip. And yet, despite all of this trade that we've highlighted for you, Trump has penalized India. And then there's the European Union's ties with Russia, which again Trump conveniently ignores. Since the beginning of the war, trade between the EU and Russia has drastically contracted, yes, but very much continues. Imports of goods from Russia in the first quarter of 2025 totaled 8.74 billion euros. That's about $10.1 billion. The EU continues to purchase oil, nickel, natural gas, fertilizer, iron and steel from Russia. And since there's so much talk of oil, let's do a deep dive of EU's oil purchases from Russia. In the first quarter of 2025, the EU's imports was at 1.48 billion euros. Also, about 17% of Europe's gas still comes from Russia via the Turk Stream pipeline and liquefied natural gas, which is LNG shipments. And then there's the China factor. In 2024, China imported $62.6 billion worth of Russian oil, while India imported $52.7 billion. Yet Trump has not raised concerns about China's oil purchases. So overall, if we look at each country's share of Russia's crude exports, China is at the top of that list at 36%. Other countries, including the likes of Turkey, are second at 30%. And then is India 28%, and finally EU at 6%. The fact that India isn't the top importer of Russian oil and yet is facing a 50% tariff is a clear indication that this is now an arm-twisting tactic by Trump.